Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. A hearty welcome to all those who have accepted our invitation and come to our Warsaw office. Welcome all those who are watching us online. We're meeting to discuss the financial and operating results of PGE Group after the 9 months of 2018. Traditionally, at the table, the results will be discussed by Mr. Henryk Baranowski, CEO, and Mr. Emil Wojtowicz, CFO. My name is Hua Freitag, and I'm the Investor Relations Manager. As usual, we will present it, then I'll give the floor over to you. I'm still receiving questions online, and they will also be discussed unless consumed by the questions answered later. Over to you, Mr. President. Good morning, a heartfelt welcome. As the director said, without further ado, we're passing on to the presentation of our quarterly results for Q3. As you will have noticed, the group has disclosed, after the takeover of the district heating assets, has disclosed a significant seasonality in the results, which has been quite visible. I mean, most of you are bound to be happy at the prolonged summer. However, this has also impacted the seasonality of the heat sales in the district heating segment. However, despite the limited impact of the district heating assets on our results, we have earned an EBITDA at last year's level. From the point of view of the 9 months, it was even larger by 8%. And let's remember that in Q3 of the last year, we observed revenues due to LCT of 1.2 billion zlotys. In operating terms, we can see a maintenance of the trend. We've increased the power generation by 20% and by 4% its distribution. The sales to end consumers was 10% larger, which was partially impacted by the reserve seller role assumption. Let's remember that the winter and the heating season is still ahead, and this is especially important while talking about the seasonality of the district heating segment. Traditionally, we will pass on to the discussion of key projects, the strategic projects of PGE Group. The advancement of the Apollo project at the end of September represented 94%, and the capex incurred so far has been of 8.8 billion zlotys. In October, we signed an annex to the contract with the general contractor. We concluded the stage of detailed and uneasy, I must admit, negotiations. What is important, the project budget has been unchanged. The new deadlines do not depart from those assumed by us at the beginning of the year. The new annex includes several important changes, including the expansion of the scope, especially adjustment of units 5 and 6 to cybersecurity requirements. At the construction site, the launching is underway with respect to block number 5. It's my pleasure to inform you that the ignition of unit 5 took place yesterday on light oil. At the construction site, whereas on unit 6, assembly works are still underway. In the case of Turów, the advancement of works at the construction site at the end of Q3 surpassed 75%. The capex incurred so far amounted to 1.9 billion zloty. So far, the construction work are focused on the closure of the buildings before the winter, so that she can easily conduct works inside the building. The most important and the closest milestone is supposed to be the pressure test of the boiler, foreseen for mid-November. PGE is continuing the process of changes. That process of changes, and it has oftentimes been discussed already, is meant at towards the diversification of the generating mix. Part of the work have already been concluded. We've concluded the project of the installation to process municipal waste and while recuperating energy. District heating is a very important element of combating smog, combating clean air. The waste that had been deposited at landfill so far will be used in an ecological way, and the district heating will be recuperated for the city. The power of the installation will cover 100% of the Rzeszów residents' requirements of hot water. The installation will also contribute to the reduction of the numbers deposited at landfills. The production launched will limit the heat production in winter and technologically will replace the production in summer on coal-burnt boilers. The energy of tomorrow focuses largely on cogeneration development. The ideas that we have in this respect are quite numerous. However, these are local investments only and relatively small, at least as compared to such constructions as Opole or Turów. Among the cogeneration projects, the largest one is the conversion of the Rybnik power plant towards cogeneration, towards district heating, which has been discussed quite significantly, as well as the construction of the cogeneration power plant in Nowa Czechnica. A new thing and quite an interesting one, I think, is the heat accumulator in Lublin. That's the idea about the effective usage of local cogeneration units that would produce energy at peaks, and the remaining heat could be accumulated and given back at night when most needed by the residents. Our transformation also assumes responsible investment decisions with a view to the future decision of PGE Group. Given the challenge which results from the increase in the CO2 emission rights, it's natural to reduce our exposure to those prices, irrespective of the fact whether their increase results from a European compromise or it surpasses the preliminary assumptions of the directive. It seems that we are confronted with such a situation right now, given the significant increase in the emission rights prices. The European Commission is obligated to convene the Climate Change Committee and to propose a remedy so that too rapid an increase in the CO2 emissions rights would not hit the European economy and replete the residents' wallets. However, I wish to emphasize that the projects conducted right now impact the reduction of CO2 emissions. Not only do they reduce the impact of the emission rights, but also the ecology. We will have this owing to the highly efficient units in Opole and Turów by replacing them with lower emissions and higher efficiency. At the same time, time, we are remaining the leaders of renewable energy in Poland. The estimated impact of the first maritime wind farm means a reduction of about 4 million tons of CO2 emissions per annum. That means that at today's emission prices, right prices, that would mean some savings for Poland's economy of 350 million zlotys. We're planning on another farm on land, as well as a project of developing photovoltaic farms. We're also not forgetting the low emissions natural gas as a source, which is complementary towards renewables. We're also remembering the broadly understood energy efficiency by modernizing the efficiency and reducing own losses. We're also reducing the losses during the transmission period and trying to reduce CO2 emissions at the same time. Owing to the aforementioned activities, by 2026 we should avoid the emissions of roughly 60 million tons of CO2. At the same time, the average emission of PGE Group will be consistently reduced. Under the most conservative scenario, by 2025, we should reduce it to the level of 0.72 tons per megawatt hour of energy net. And in our view, this is just the beginning of the changes we're in for. In a longer perspective, we're planning on the continuation of maritime wind farms and zero and low emissions cogeneration power plants. Now I'd like to give the floor over to Mr. Emil Wojtowicz, the CFO. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I will pass on to the discussion of the situation in the electricity market, and then I will discuss several operating ratios and conclude by what's probably of most interest to us, that's to say, the outlook for 2019. As we take a look at Q3 of this year, we can see a decrease in the net imports. Poland was still a country to import energy, however, at much lower volumes than in Q2, which was rather unique. As we take the historical perspective, Q3 with net imports of below 1 terawatt-hour was at the same level as it was in Q2 2017 and Q3 2017 or Q1 of this year. The generation of Polish power plants increased by 2.5%, with the increase of consumption by 2.3. Everybody notices the significant increase in the prices. That's the graph below for the 3 quarters or even more. By November, the average price amounts to roughly 240 zlotys, whereas in the comparable period of the previous year it was 170 zlotys. Of course, we know what the reasons are behind that increase. We've been repeating it every quarter. The main driver, the main factor triggering energy price increase is CO2 emissions rates increase. Secondly, that's the expected increase in fuel prices. It is also observed that the prices have decreased since November, both the prices and CO2 prices, and consequently energy prices. The high prices are also observed on the spot market. as a result of the mix of the forward prices from last year and the current spot prices, the average price earned by our conventional power generation amounts to 176 zlotys for the 9 months of the year. If we were to take into account the acquired assets, which are more exposed to the spot market, the average price amounts to 178 zlotys. As I've said, in Q3, the net imports have been reduced, which you can see in another graph, which compares the energy prices in various markets. You can see that those prices have been changing much in the same direction. The increase in fuel prices and emission rights, CO2 emission rights, have not only impacted the prices in Poland, our wholesale prices, but also the prices in other markets. Even if we were to analyze the spread between Poland and Germany, then it has been reduced rather than expanded of late. So, owing to the shrinkage of the spread, also the net imports to Poland has been reduced. In the next slide, you can see the generation volume by type of fuel for the 3 quarters. Of course, you can see an increase in the generation volume, mostly on hard coal. That's a result of the assets acquired in Rybnik, mostly Rybnik. In Q3, we've had a slight increase in the most margin-generating fuel, that's to say lignite. That results from the base effect a little bit, because in Q3 of last year there was still the renovation refurbishment at the Bełchatów power plant underway, and in Q3 of this year, actually the Bełchatów power plant was up and running, whereas in Turów 2 units were being refitted. One of them has been completed, the other one is still underway. As we pass on to the generation volume by type of fuel for the 3 quarters, then we have quite similar results. An increased hard coal-based generation owing to the acquisition of the Rybnik power plant, a very similar level based on lignite, and a slightly smaller owing on natural gas, owing to the modernization of slightly lower on lignite, owing to the modernization of the Turów power plant. Now the next slide. As we pass on to the financials, it is obvious and most visible to see the impact of one-offs in last year in Q3 2017. We received a significant adjustment owing to LTCs, well, it was 1.2 billion. And as you reduce it from the one-offs, EBITDA, repetitive EBITDA is roughly at the same level, which results from also the seasonality, as mentioned by the CEO, the cogeneration, the district heating assets are mostly operational in Q1 and Q4. In Q3 is actually the weakest quarter for district heating assets, hence they did not contribute so much to the financial results in Q3. Having analyzed the factors that impacted the EBITDA in Q3, other than the one-offs, that's obviously the energy price increase, the higher wholesale price by roughly 16 zlotys for conventional generation. All in all, the revenues grew by roughly 250 million owing to the energy price increase only. Of course, this was mitigated by the increase in the CO2 emissions. That's the second largest bar, the red one. That's 170 zlotys more spent on CO2. And one more hint or digression as regards CO2. This year, the CO2 costs in the individual quarters are not uniform. For the valuation of those costs, the FIFO method is used, which means that the first cheapest CO2 rights occurred in Q1 and Q3, in Q3 and Q4. The more expensive CO2 rights will be expensed. This needs to be borne in mind if we are to try and estimate the results for Q4 only. Among other factors that have impacted this EBITDA for Q3, that's the result on the wholesale trade in electricity. There's been a lot of volatility in our position, which has meant that the result in that quarter was about 90 million lower than in the previous year. The increase in fuel increase, that's coal and natural gas, that's roughly 50 million. The volatility of energy prices has also reverberated on the margin for end consumers, which decreased by almost 40 million. In terms of distribution, owing to the higher volume, the results were higher by almost 50 million. Personnel costs, given the observed labor costs or salary increases were also higher than in the corresponding period of 2017, and that impact was of roughly a little bit less than 70 million. A couple of operating ratios. On lignite, we had a lower capacity, availability. As I mentioned, the refitting in Turów, which was mitigated by a slightly higher usage of the capacity. We had a similar situation on hard coal, where the overhaul took a longer time in Opole. However, there was a better utilization of the capacity. In terms of the CHP plants, there was a better utilization because September was warmer than in the previous year. For wind-based assets, we had a higher availability owing to the lower rate of failures and slightly lower overhaul ratios, but something which is out of our control, the windiness was lower, and which was to our disadvantage. In terms of distribution, here it's been quite optimistic or moderately optimistic, because we've been distributing more and have had an increased volume year on year, and the increases are higher than the consumption in the entire system. We've also been reducing the network losses over the last 12 quarters, from quarter to quarter. As regards the SAIDI and SAIFI, as compared to the previous years, we've had decreases, except that last year those levels were quite high. And for SAIDI, after the 3 quarters, we're at the level of 3/4 of the limit defined by the regulator, by ERO. And for SAIFI, after 3 quarters, we've already reached the limit defined by the regulator, which we will unfortunately most probably exceed. Whereas last year, the reason for such high values of the ratios were such factors as high winds, storms, natural reasons. This year we've also observed another reason, which means higher network working time. Our contractors, external contractors, are requesting higher, longer periods of times, owing to the lack of qualified manpower, skilled workers. That, as you can see, is also a factor that we also have to take into account. As regards CapEx, has amounted to a little bit less than 4 billion zlotys. The largest investment project is Opole, as it was mentioned by the CEO, that the annex has been signed. Another significant item is the construction in Turów and the completed waste-to-plant energy waste-to-energy plant in Rzeszów. So here we're talking about the level of a stable 1 billion zlotys. In renewable energies, we're waiting for the auction, and our company is still continuing its modernization modernization works in the peak pump and storage power plants. And historically speaking, passing from the historical look towards the outlook for the next year, what we can expect in conventional generation, as you take a look at the contracts already concluded and our forecasts in terms of prices by the end of the year and going forward, what we can expect on the spot market for the next year. We believe that the average wholesale energy price will be at the level of between 238 and 242 zlotys per megawatt hour. This has a flip side with regard to the CO2 prices, where we had significant increases, and this is going to be visible in the next year. Among important things, we're also planning on a higher refitting and overhaul burden in Bełchatów, where we are earning the highest margin, and this is gonna impact the results of the entire segment. We've also talked about the wholesale prices increasing owing to the increase in the fuel prices. This is observed. We expect another increase in hard coal prices by another 10%, which should also be complemented by the increase in the coal transport prices. We roughly know the outlook of the cogeneration supporting program, and here we can observe that that system supports new installations, whereas it will most probably result in a decrease in revenues for existing assets. In new assets, or generally district heating assets, we are expecting a decrease in the results owing to the tariff system, which transfers the increases both of coal prices and CO2 prices not entirely in the first year. And the other reason is that the new cogeneration system, if it's accepted, it will result in fewer revenues than the one which is operational right now. In renewable energy is where we expect increases. The energy prices are higher, and the results of renewable energies are not impacted by the CO2 price increases. However, the factor which is uncontrolled by us are weather conditions in terms of aeolic or wind energy as well as water energy. In terms of supply, we expect the maintenance of the market trends and a high price volatility, which will also be triggering some volatility in the margins earned by the retail supply segment. And the last but not least segment, which is distribution, that's where we expect that the regulatory asset base will attain to a level of 16.7 billion zlotys, whereas the weighted average cost of capital we expect at a level that will be comparable to this year's WACC of 6.015%. Thank you very much for this part, and over to Jakub. And I will give the floor with utmost pleasure to you, as we agreed. At first, I'll invite you to asking questions, so feel free to do so. Paweł Pucharski, Santander Bank. Is it working? Yes, it is. I have a couple of questions. The first one, you're talking about offshore as a project which is underway. You're saying how much you'll be saving of CO2 and so on. So let me start from the very beginning. So what's the price you're expecting on offshore? What the capex is going to be? When you're going to start and finish? So such simple questions for the first 1,000 megawatts. So that's my first question. The second and third one, okay, the second one, distribution. You mentioned that you will rather be unlikely to meet one of the goals defined for this year. Does this mean a risk of a penalty to be included in the tariff for the next year? And have you factored that risk in your expectations, in your estimates for the next year? And the third question, what is your expected G tariff path while preparing forecasts for 2019 in terms of the sales? Before I even ask you about conventional. Okay, let's be moderate in our questions. Let's start with the nicest, probably, strategic option of PGEs, which is offshore. The work is underway. The windiness analyses are underway. We will soon be analyzing the seabed, and we would like to finish those works as soon as possible. However, we realize that, especially on the seabed, we can find something that we would rather not find, which might slow down our activities. We assume that the ready-to-build status should be achieved by the end of 2021. So the first offshore farms, or the first installations, could be operational within 3 years from that date. We realize that this is quite an ambitious plan. However, ambitious plans are our middle name. As regards capex, I think during the previous conference we said there was roughly 12 million zlotys as regards the first 1,000, whereof 30% is the connection cost. So roughly 3 billion zlotys, if I remember correctly. As regards the prices, I wouldn't like to be quoted on that, but those prices will also depend on the technology prices at the moment when we start the construction. This technology, as you very well know, is getting cheaper. As each new technology, it's most expensive at the very beginning, then it starts decreasing. What we would like to emphasize most of all is the maximization of the local content in the entire investment projects. That's to say, the involvement of local Polish companies in the construction and then the operation of those companies. We take into account the fact that this might lower our capital expenditures that way. Thank you. The second one? The second question was about distribution, whether we perceive a risk that we might exceed the SAIDI and SAIFI ratios this year, which will have an impact on the 2020 tariff. Yes, we can see such a risk, especially for SAIFI, which is already at the level which is close to the one which is defined as a limit for the entire year. And the question is whether we have factored it in our forecasts. Yes, we rather try to be conservative in our planning. So unless some factors occur that will allow us to reasonably argument that we might avoid such penalties, then we include it in our planning. And as regards tariff G, I understand that this was rather about the supplies, yes? Yes. So as regards, since we are close to the moment of submission, of submitting the application, we prefer not to comment on this. We can see some factors that, such as the energy price increases, indicate that they should be included in the tariff. We can also see a postulate of protecting the consumer's interests, and we believe that the regulator will take all those various factors into account and make a decision that will balance both our interests and those of other supplying companies as well as consumers. And to relate to the distribution tariff, we are providing you with the outlook for 2018, where we include the prices for 2017. So the risk for SAIDI-SAIFI for 2018 rather means some risk for 2020. Any further questions? Yes, Robert Maipopea. I'd like to ask to wrap up the outlook for supply, which is stable. You're not assuming any drive downwards connected with the G tariff. It's just a cross-check towards what was asked. The second question about conventional energy, that's average household price 238 to 242. How does it correspond to your realized price? Is this the price you can see you will realize, or is it someplace lower or higher than that price? And another project about those development projects, since we talked about that outshore projects, what about those gas and steam projects? Is it all planned under ZEDO? And capex per megawatt, if you could just add to this, and photovoltaics, how much it costs actually 100 megawatts in photovoltaics. Thank you. On G tariff, G tariff is not the tariff which the supplying company earns most of all. In our plans, we're not assuming any major decrease or increase, for that matter, in the supply company's results owing to a G tariff. The question about the average price at the level of 238 to 262, which was indicated on the slide as 242, that's the price we mean to realize. That's the average price of the forwards and spots and the base and the profile. That's our average price that we're planning to realize. Another question was about capex on ZEDO and capex on ZEDO. So Robert asked whether the 3 units we asked whether all under the same system and what involves this. So what you're expecting for those blocks, for those units, competitive prices, naturally. Okay, so let's relate it to the prices that you assume. Do you think the price will be lower or higher? This is going to be different gas. What is being used as of today in our installations in Zielona Górza or Gorzów, it's local gas. It has different technical parameters as well as a different price. As regards gas, natural gas for ZEDO, we assume it's going to be, well, it's going to be delivered by such enterprises as PGE and IG. Let's assume it. As regards the gas, the natural gas prices at the moment of the commissioning, I will not venture to quote any real or assumed value. We have various price paths that have been taken into account to evaluate the investment efficiency of that project, but alluding to what we are talking about, these are only two, whether these are two gas units in ZEDO or any others. So these ones are the ones which are the closest and most advanced. But we're also taking a look at natural gas as a prime energy source, for instance, for the modernization of cogeneration units, which can be exemplified by the Czechnica project. 150 megawatts, is it all ZEDO, or are these two ZEDO? That's 200, 2 times 500, and 500 is also in other locations. We have different ideas For instance, the replacement of coal-fired units with a gas-fired unit, but this is still before the decisions of investment committees. And the question about the prices, whether, well, the capex under these technologies of about 3.5 million per megawatt. So that's the results, global results, and those benchmarks have to be related to our expectations. We still have to remember that there are still a couple of years ahead before we even start a tendering procedure, a good couple of years, but it's different to relate to this other than through technological benchmarks available globally. And as regards the capex on PVs, we also evaluate that it's between 3 and 4 million per megawatt. I realize this is a broad band, a broad spread, but as we look at the results of various tendering procedures, unfortunately, that's the way it looks for various locations and tendering procedures. Any further questions from the room? Pavel? Okay, so let's pass on to conventional energy. I would request that you indicate the scale of those planned modernization-related shutdowns for Bełchatów in 2019 as compared to the same modernization projects in 2018, and secondly, whether in your plans for 2019 you've been including any positive or negative impact. That's also a good question from Unit 1 in Opole. The Opole, theoretically, it should kick in the, I think, in the second semester of 2019. Is it included? And if so, is it with a plus or still with a minus? Owing to the potentially low availability and so on and so forth. That's a question with a thesis embedded. So let me take the question on Opole. The planned commissioning of the unit is to take place in June 2019, in mid-2019. Since it's going to be a unit that will only start operating, we're not expecting that over the first couple of months it will contribute to the margin in a particular way. We won't be loading it in supply terms beforehand. Rather than that, it's going to be used next year for spot supplies, spot trading. That's why in our projections we assume that the margins both on Unit 5 and 6 will rather be included starting from 2020 rather than starting next year. If the current deadlines, commissioning deadlines are met, and if during the operation of the units no unexpected failures or inefficiencies occur, it is probably feasible to expect a slight margin. However, we still don't expect it next year. That's not an asset that we will be expecting to realize any major margin on. And the question on Bełchatów. Well, the current modernization or overhaul plans for 2019 assume the higher burden in Bełchatów by 3-4 units throughout the year. So in fact, to compare it with was most easier to extrapolate, that's like an entire 1 unit throughout the year. So we mean to shut down 2-3 units. Well, the very realization might be changing. Our plans are verified by the operator, but that's our plan. If you are to take the volume, you need to take a benchmark loading of the unit and to translate that. It's going to be quite a significant load volume-wise for the very Bełchatów power plant. However, it needs to be emphasized that our overhaul plans are significant. However, the overhaul plan has to be coordinated with the operator, and indeed, having agreed on the overhaul plan with the operator, we will be able to provide you with a responsible answer as to when and which units will be shut down. Yes, exactly, and this process is still underway. It is supposed to take place until the end of November, and then the operator will be announcing the over. So you mean to modernize many units, as many as possible. However, the operator can in fact disallow that as usual. Well, disallow it will factor in the situation in the system, which would imply higher volumes and the impact on if such a risk exists. Does exist? There is such a risk, yes. If we have no further questions from the floor, yes, there are. Alexander Kwiatkowski, JP Morgan's. Morning, everyone. I have a question on the recent good performance of the stock exchange quotes. Could you comment on this, where it might result from? Can it be connected with the recent announcement of the Autosun acquisition? It was not by you. Well, definitely the information about Autosun has no impact on our listed price. I'd be very surprised. I'd be very surprised if it did. This project is at a very preliminary stage rather than a final one, so I would rather not connect the increase we've been observing over the last couple of weeks with such kind of investments. A couple of words about the atomic power plant, nuclear power plant. There's no nuclear and there's offshore. Does it mean that strategically you have already made a choice that it's going to be that offshore is going to be the next development path rather than nuclear energy? In other words, should we forget nuclear or not really? I don't think we should be forgetting any zero-emission price sources. The problem is that for their materialization, we need to have several factors to be met. And let me remind you that PGE J1 is operational. It is performing environmental impact analysis and preparing its project. The decision on the materialization of that strategic option in the form of a commencement of the investment process on site will be made when all the factors that will indicate the ultimate effectiveness of such a project have been verified by us. Also, The idea of the tables and graphs on slide number 7 was to show you the projects that contribute to the changes. However, we approach this, yes, by 2025, that's true. By 2026 or 26, we should rather not expect that any nuclear power plant would be built. Krzysztof Myszewski, Trigger. I'd like to ask you about your perception of the CO2 market. There's been that price effect supported by RWE purchases, but structurally we still have oversupply. Do you expect increases or decreases of CO2 prices going forward? I'm not sure if you used the word CO2 market, but I think it's quite remote from a market, from being a market. It's hard to evaluate with the application of methods that are used for the markets of other commodities. The EU is trying to change the system in such a way that that oversupply could be automatically taken off. We can see at the moment, we can see a reason why that mechanism should be applied, which is also part of the ETS interventions, marketing interventions, owing to the high increase into CO2 prices, because it has exceeded the threefold levels of over the 6 months. So, whether the increases have only been triggered by the purchase by other players or by pure speculations. If a speculator believes that an investor is one that needs it for a longer period, whereas here, I use the word speculator without any negative undertones. I mean, just a person who earns on price volatility. If someone believed that the EU would arrive at an increase in CO2 emission rights from 5 to 25 euro over even the first 5 years, then it made sense to buy CO2 based on that faith, even in a non-linear way, because from 5 to 25, that's 5 times, the profit is not easy to be achieved in other markets. So, despite the threefold, there has been no intervention. Well, that's what the regulation means. So there was some upside potential, and someone used it. Well, so I understand that you assume that it's not going to exceed the 3 times, because it's roughly the area from 7 to 17, roughly? Is it? And And you mean that it should stop? There are analysis in place that indicate such a level. I mean, we're not following CO2 closely from the point of view of earning money on the increases and decreases, perhaps with the exception of a small portfolio, which is a purely speculative portfolio, which is absolutely negligible from the group's results point of view. We've assumed a strategy, a hedging strategy, assuming the hedging of our position. So in a sense, the increases and decreases are not something that would significantly change our margin. That changes both the costs and the revenues, but it definitely changes the margin. One more question from the room, Paweł. That question from the room is about the dividend, because you mentioned that you would not be paying it until 2018, till the profits for 2018. So I understand that 2019 means an end of major capex on the units, and they will start contributing. So I understand that the company will be back to its dividend payment policies starting from 2019. Well, the current policy is very well known, the one that you just quoted. As of today, that's the binding policy, and you can assume that it will be maintained in the sense that the company will become a dividend-paying company. There have been a couple of sentences, or one major sentence, on that we will be taking a look at capex, on possible M&A transactions and the indebtedness level. So you should really take those factors into account while performing your analyses. We still have a couple of questions from the online users, but I will, with your permission, I will address them after the conference by email or online, because we've exceeded our time limits. So unless you have any further questions from the room, I don't see any. I'd like to thank you very much for coming, for the active participation, and you're all invited to the next meeting in March during the announcement of the annual results, and see you then. Thank you. Thank you very much.